I'm going to tell you something I have never said out loud to Hain 101 except my bird town. In a retired pliard plumber and Namhair plum, beer nain Herod. Hobart we Effrey doors down, from me now, and comes by on twos 3 dog. Tucky breast, green ban casserole, sweet potato pea, the whole thing. I set the table the way my wife was too. The good plossom mats. The when my wife was ed to. The good plossom mats. The ones we only brutch out for company. I even put a small candle in the center, because she always said a table without a candle was just a flat surface with plates on it. I sat down 8:05 in the afternoon and I waited until 9:08 night. Nobod Calnets Corman, and waited what until 9:08 night. My Dodger sent a text ape 8:47 that sad sorry dead. Thurns got thrays with the kids and dots ray with the kids and not make it hope you had a good one. I read that text 4 time. Then I set the Ford face down on the tail. Then I set the Ford face down on the tail and look at it that candle burning down and it tuh. This is what I have been pretending was temporary. My name is George Tully. I am 68 years old. I spent 31s. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the Pardark when I connect to of Montwin for the Countin of Marning, Adhio. I build bridges and drainage stations and roads that people drive on every single day without main carring. Tat was fine by me. The work was real and the math was honest and you could see what you did when you were doon. I were down. I like that about it. My wife Helen was a bear as down. She was the steadiest person I have ever can. When say alleged it started in her shoulders and worked it its way up, and by the time it reached her face the whole room felt different. I soaked pear plate of potato salad off a folding table, and it landed on her shows and she look up at me and sigh WW Pell I hope you are as good with bridges as you are with coordination. The Vibo, Lena, the older one. Antend to pharmaceutical cells and moved to Columbus with her husband Derek about 8 years before any of this started. Anne Pauline, WH stayed in Dayton, worked as an office manager for a dental practice, and had 3 boys with the ways for the logist and mostest bows vinnerfuls caneverful was wach and mostly did in my life. Helen and Anne were the kind of parents we showed up. Helen and Anne were the kind of parents we showed up. Little Lagoo games in 90-degree heat. Goal plays, where the kids for go plays were liners in 10-7 drabic. Their fidwa is squapped anyway. When the girls had their own kids WB to rove to Columbus for every major, Tench, and Derot to Viv to Paulins for Enspring and Vennyspornit. Helen kept a little buen friend forn the Iron Fens. Helen kept a little notebook in her purse with everybody. Tat was how she loved people. She kept track. Then Helen got sick. It was her pancreas. Stage 4, which if you know anything about that diagnosis, you know there is not a good stage, for story that ends the way you want. The doctors in Dayton were honest with yous whirly and I appreciated that even though I hated every word of it. What I will tell you is that during tust 14 months, I learned how to natomatication a scattered cruda across 66 agro 6. I learned how to ask her how she felt in a way that not make her feel like she was being monitored. I drove her help her to every appointment. I said in every waiting room. I filled out every form. I called the insurance company more time. I filled out every form. I called the insurance company more times than I have words for. Lena came down from Columbus twice during toast 14 months. Twice. Paulin twice. Paulin was closer and she came more of pen but still, not as of 10 as of hand as I had expected. I told myself they were scared expected. I told myself they were ton as I had expected. I told myself they were not now toe to be pounded. I am still not sure I was wrong about that. PUCS. All's a dwev seving lo day even when I did not know how hate it's not how a teether and nobody give me an out bot. Helene passed it on a set a day morning and marching in March. She was 61 years old. I was studying in the care next to her mektav. Fries beam there seem 3 in the courting and marting because. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. I always find it hilts to now, to as out there listen. The funery is everything Helen would have rolled hers ev. What have rolled her yees hey if had happened to someone discreetly love. Because it was all for her. Her patients over the years. Her colleagues from the hospital. Women she had stayed friends with from high school. Both my daughters were their wapamilis, and Lennis wahan deret, duas bezindas deret quaviziota financial, advisor at p-health management fire manovers seemed to be doing a cough, monoger vanser. Of wumid suefidsaver, Brumi was inters. You notice thens and file them away, and only understand them later. The week after the funeral both girls were attentive. Derek sent me a text saying he was there if I ever wanted to talk through the financial side of thens, the estate at thens, the estate and whatever, you'll see, and that he just wanted to take some stairs off my plate. I should have paid closer attention to what Hashali said. The first year was just grief. I do not know how else to describe it. I went to work. I came home. I made food that I did not particularly taste. I mowed the lawn because Helen licked the yard neat, and some hobbits do not stop just because the person is gone. The calls from Lena drop it to Hav, from Lena drop it to Hav to Hans, Ed, A, by summer, and ons every 2 weeks by fall. Pauline's visits went from weekly to monthly to Hond. I understood that. I had not become a person to heed constant check and orn. I just missed my wife, a myfen wife, and to so occasionally weiss in the flies whiz phone would ring and frown, and it would be my kids wanting nothing in particular. The first Christmas with Helene I asked someone and nothing in particular. The first Christmas without Helen I asked someone, all Louise. You was not a complicated system. Lena called in November and said they were doing Christmas in Calamus with Barrett's parents and had his brother's family, and it was a laddo. Pauline said she was doing Christmas morning, ate her mother-in-law's in Springfield, and that I was welcome to come for Christmas Eve. I drove to Springfield on Christmas Eve, and essayed at a full of people I barely curling formed on Christmas Eve, and at a ta full of poop I barely curmeal, and drove home at 1 by 9 p.m. I told myself it was the first year. Everything was still raw for everybody. It would settle. Ross and Purston, it not settle. It did not settle. Year 2, I tried to get ahead of it. I called Lena. In Osikober, I said I would like to host Thanksgiving. AG said she would check. She called back 4 days later and said that they had a later, and said they had a prody committed to Durrett's parents place in Dublin, and it was hard to prange and peel blinate, and do was hard to change that now. I called it Paulin, she Problin, and we prain shed, that now. I called it Paulin, she sad Problin, firsty Problin. Kankesh giving tam and nobody shouted. I drove to a dinner on Route 35 and ate turkey and stuffing on a counter stool. Now stool next to a man was wetting a paperback and did not spake to pake to men one stool. Next to back and did not spake to me on somehow that was the best part of the day. The samful I started finding out about thens, though other people. My grandson's 7th birthday party. I found out from the boy's teacher was hopped from the boy's teacher was also my Nate for. I sent a card and a check and Paulinus tech thanks dad he loved it. I never habarred from my grandson directly. He was 7 and had not know to call. But she did. Year 3, I injured my back shovelian after a Vericenzo storm. Nothing during. Just the kind of thing that happens when you are 64 and you push to hoard because you do not to amats quina help. I was in bed for 8 for a week with a heating pad and presentments and anti-inflammatories and a reberator that was running loon. Sad no dad that sounds awful and acid if I had a nachp if I could nachbert which could kun n. I said yes. I figured something out. I called Paulin. She said could probably kun. My neighbor Harlot Actley, the one I mentioned at the start, he was the one which brought me soup and picked up my preserksments. Harold was Abed Hadcown for Cirction. Harold was abbot cown for 3 years, and my doctors had cown hound for their intwite lives. Yerford was my what was happening and started what was happening and started to stop pretend otherwise. My older grandson Piles Middle Porlime is Middle Boy played it on a free, played in a regional secretary tournament about 45 miles from my house. I found out about it because I poured from Pauline Kewen him on. I had not been told the date or the caution. I got in the car and drove over anyway. When I walked up to the field pelled, Pauline saw me and her face did something of face. It smiled after it and cam and hugged me and said, "Dad, I didn't know you're coming." I said I didn't know I was invited. There was a pause that was about 3 seconds long and held a lot more. Huzzard Motter fan 3 seconds long and held a lot more than 3 seconds worth of information in it. I said OWE, just didn't take it was the kind of thing you would want to come to conshoe. I make grandson play the skin half of the game from the far end of Verays. What none of them knew during any for this was that I had been quietly helping both of my daughters and their families financially for years without saying a word about it When Pauline and her husby hand went through the rough stretch after he got haid off from his logistics job, I covered 3 months of their mortgage frove. I rangman with their bank bruff of arrangement per though an arrangement with their bank. That looked like a hardship assistance program. They never knew it was me. When Len's daughter needed speak the rappy that their insurance only party covered, I pay their insurance only party covered, I pay the remaining balance directly to the clinic. Len insisted in passing that their insurance had spepted up which she had not expected up, which it did not mart her tipted spepted. It not spepted up. I wanted her to be okay, not to owe me anything. That was how I thugged about it then. Year 5 was when Derek started making me uncomfortable. A comment I asked her, one of the few times I saw them that year, about how Dayton oral estate had been a peen appearanting and had I given any thought for fort I want to do with the house long term. I said I given to stay in it. He noted like I had sodded stomaching he was going to foring. A fell weeks later, Lena called and said Derek wanted to work for Tover for do beave my investment exation sounds, just as a fetzer, just as to fave or just to care. Frenning thing was fing was per de ferdy and was belber. I said the hearted refeeve and fing was per de fell. I said I dared fev vang was bear wary. She said dared quad spec was better. What did I plan to do if I pension? Had you paid my ficieries after Helen passed? Did I have a lil? Was it recent? Was by half Thurenkin? Was my attorney? Each one was wapped in Conkenern. Each one was wapped in Conkenern betor. E6 one was wapped in Carton poured summit before they got there. Year 6 I had a scare summit theme before they got there. A spot on a scan that turned out to be nothing significant, a small nodule they wanted to monitor. But for 3 weeks I did not note there. For 3 weeks I drew myself to appointments and essay tool one on exam rooms and read brochures in waiting rooms that wation submitting rooms that were destined to be informative and were mostly just terrifying. I did not tell my dodgers. I already knew what Len would do, which was express concern in a way that somehow curled back to what I planned to do with the house. And I already knew what Pauline would do with the house. And I already knew what Pauline would do, which was feel gillet for about a week and then go cute again. When the results came back clear, I drove home and sat on the back porch and on the back fortand. The Nadfrova's dog dig a hole in here his dog. Rend hair wired and hand felt the avicens of Helen in a way that was nonce of like way. When Freg that was not carafe exactly anymore. It was not permanent now. Part of the W father. Year seconding more. I turned 65 in September. Helen and I had talked about what we do W word, but 65 back when she was still W wheel. A trip somewhere. Nothing extravagant. Maidmansful. Maidmanshefigant. What I told myself instead was that my dogters would do something. I did not expect a party. I expected a meal. I expected party brie. I expected to be all clean. 60 feet to be all include. 65 is a millstone. Everyone counts 65 is a milestone. Everyone counts 65 is a milestone. Called on the morning of birthday and Saudi bardiad. Barded dod that a believable spielert zone. Polly untexted. A text. What she texted was happy bay dad with a cake emoji. I started text for Claire. I started that text for a while. Not because I needed a party. Because I remembered what Helen and I did for Leon 46 2 years before she got sick. W deared to Frinfind, surprised her 8 work with flowers and lunch, then thurhent her bens. Then trehev her air ben night with 12 of her friends and a cans and a Kate Helen baked from scratch and decorated herself. I remembered what WD did from scratch and decorated herself. WE flew to Columbus and took her and Derek and the kids out for a Derek Finney dinner that cost more than Humberthany Worley, spent on anything because she was worth it. Happy Day Dad, KB Day Dad. Copy Bay, Gay be dead. H grilled some chicken and W meets the Reds game and he said some nothing like hell of a birthday. Years and night and said it frim, like hell of the birthday. Years and by zeal of Wes and W weathers and Cradavi. Lear 8 was the graduation. Lena's docurin? I had been looking forward to it sign. I heard about it on January. I called Lena and asked if I could come and she said of course Dad and gave me the date in time. I put it in my calendar with a reminder 4 days out and on other the day before. I derived from Dayton, about 75 minutes, stopped up and buck of what of well of flowers because Kate had all the beloved flowers because Kitty said allo, ever since she was small, and Helen you said to keep a ever since she was small and Helen doos to keep a yellow tubes on the kitchen and Kitteen and Kitty woman make a first thing of vein of every single time see over. I got to the school and found the gymnasium where the cernui was being held and walked it and saw by Dutch's Penetsard's panned. Darrett's panis panets, and her family all seated in a sister, and her family all seated in a reseb sachet with a little card on the end that had their name on it, and enough cares for everyone on it. Dear group, Lena saw me come in. She stood up and walked over, and I could see something happening in her face before she got to me. She said dead. On the way that means something she did not want to say was calming, seeing she did not want to say was calming. S8 Derek's family kinda filled up the resort Sackton, and there are not a lot of on seats. I looked past her epidigynesium. Nazium, there were open seats. Hastert, there went a museum. There were open seats elsewhere, non-reserved but footable, and fining. Essayed right yes, of course, and she walked me to a row about 6 shins away from where her family was sitting. I sat down by myself with a quet of yellow flowers on my lap and might grandiquert walk across a phage. To get her deperboloma and I clapped, and I kept my face completely still because I had a lot of plastics digging that by them. After the ceremony Darrett's family gathered in the lobby and took votes. I handed Lean the flowers and she gave them to Flowers, and she gave them to Kay them to Flode, thanks Grandpa, and went back to posing with Varick's sister's Dodd. I drove home and called Harold when I got there and told him what happened and Harold said, George, I have been watching this for about 3 years and you are going to have to make a decision at some point. I told him I knew what happened next is the part. I have never told anyone except my attorney. Nail Cagfam, the Wolf has handed my affairs for 20 years and wears to mount affairs for 20 years and wenged by. The Brang Manager, Womane had canton for about 5 years, said she was calling as a courtesy. Someone had come and chew the branch asking about my askingen. Specifically whether I had a durable power of attorney on file. Whether my benefitchy designations were curtains or curtained, and what this process has was rand of curt, and what the process was for disputting of financial discussion paid by a financial besensheed. I thanked her for calling and I sat down at my kitchen table and talked about every offhand question Derek had asked over the past 3 years and understood them all differently now. thoroughly now. Bertufferly now. And not call my dodgers. The picket up the forum caldneo, and multolshend, to the whole tears, went it a rupiting, which is one of the reasons I have used fund have reason for 20t. When I finish it, he said gershid. Write down what the Brownch managed. He said he dirge. What down what the Brownch manager told you. Date, time, Kadison, Kaditols what she want she. I wrote I down that evening. Every word I could remember. Then I started writing down everything as spined, frafting 7 every fring. Every dollar. I had coolly sent toward my dargers and their families over 8s whereas with hars each wed one when hun knowing it I was mean uppers. The mortgage payments for Paulin. The speechik therapy bills for Lena. The speechik therapy bills for Lena's. I put the legal pad in the fireproof lockbox under my bed that I had blockwood when Helen and I first moved into the house and never thugged into the house and never thug aught I would need for something like this. A FWX after that I was at Tanglena's house for a Sunday dinner, one of maybe 4 times on Nat Kellen Dobbins Brady, or when I've been there for a Thora bin Neil. And I was in the kitchen helping thing for foreign. For one hell, I was in the kitchen helping myself to water when I hear Derek in the hallway talking to Lena and talking to Enna to water. I heard him say need a clear picture of what is actually sitting on before he does submitting we can reverse. Lean said something I could not make out. Not make out. I turned on the faucet and let the water run for a FWCs so they would know still they would know I was still in the kitchen. Then I turned it off and walked back to the tail and sat down and talked it about nothing, walked up nothing for the next 9 minutes and drove home and called Nivnig's knowed him it was Tom and told him it was Tom. Anniel said, what do you want to do, Jeward? I said, I want to retreat. I want to sell the house. I want to sursuture everything so that nobody can challenge my ditches, your sochins or question my mind or put their hands on anything I beal before I am ready to let go. And then why before deflare hands on anything I beal before I am ready to let it go. And then, Hes said that is all entirely within your rights. He said give me a week and come back in, and we will go true fit properly. But first I had one more thing to do. The Christmas dinner. I knowed how to sew and their senate. And honestly, I have a scared myself the same thing. The answer is this. Helen always said that you should never make a depeak be yeet squishin out of anger that you cannot undo. And I wanted to be sure. I wanted one last clear look at what I was dealing. Just one plain, Unambi Jevu's answer for my own family, to my face. So I called both Dodgers and early Deckener. I did not suggest. I told them directly that I wanted one Christmas dinner together and that I would can cook everything, and they did not need to bring anything, and I just need to bring anything, and I just needed to know they were coming. Pauline said that sounded really nice and she would Rosmink. Lena said probably yes and that Derek would need to confirm because of his families us chittle but sheet what would work. Probably yes. Takaris stand a ham both because Derek did not eat ock meat and I had bained as accommodating. Derek's preferences from 4-15 wins, 4-15 years. I found the good table cloth in the setter chest in the bedroom and washed it and pressed it. I set the table for cutters 410, both familians, all 5 grandkids, even Dirk. The food was done by 4 in the half-dids, even Dirk. The food was done by 4 in the afternoon. As swerd and said, they were running bind and would try to make it by 7. I said okay, et tai quarrel arenan, for broins rare. At 7 Paulinet serene. No answer. At 7, Paulinet texted. Said her hers with hands back. Hid one out and they weren't texted. Said her hervin hands back, he had gone out, and they weren't going to make, and she was Sora. Said Derek's parents hadn't toward it, uting them to stay, and she was so sorry, Daddy. She called, He getted me daddy and the techt. I sat and told. I sat at not techt. I sat that telve that table for I for attires. I want you to understand what I mean when I said that. I just at the table Helen's table's cloth was on and looked at the 10 place settings and this naham then hum that nobody was going to stoff, and the cranberries farzaf that salad like orangens and thawed like orangens, and thubbook and barenbrins and tupid about 34 years of marriage and 10 that a book Helen her per what is all skirtle intend. That she had spent her carer being present at the most important mordant moments of first and injures lives, and our doctors peers could not be present at they thurzan. At yef or 5, I got up, I covered the food in foil. I caught, tend. I went to my desk and opened a new document on my computer and started writing. Not a letter writing. Not a letters to my praf to for tings. Not yet. Just facts. A chronologius. When I was done, I printed it, signed it, and put it in the lockbox with the legal pad. The next morning I was at Neil's office to stay 8:30. Over the full soloing forward months Neil and I took pet. Everything I forward everything I had an cat. Everything I had an OK part everything I had in dot. The house went at the market in February, except in 12 days. I had Boket and Wealthdanes. I had votes with Helen I 1989 for $97,000, except for $431,000. I thought it about der ex common about Dayton oral estate a PD name when I signed at the cloak and dollars with th. I had a rental property too, a duplex I had bought in 2003 as in first Arden, investment and managed myself ever since then. My dargers kiers can knew about it in the way they're who they care. Knew about it on most of my assets, vaguely and without interest until recently. That's ably and without interest until recently. I had a brokerage AC account that Helen and I had been since in 1995. Nailed me respichashits. Nailed of me rescutcher it. Nailed I also put to date of record. Not to rise it of every dollar record. Not to rise it of every dollar record. Not to write dollar diftaward vigurtivs over 8 years. Paulines are his additions. Both amounts were due equam ted down to the specific payment. If one ever tried to help in to payment, if one third tried to salamide of fina bean spent taken advantage of or was not of sound, mint, that due equament would answer for them before they finished the sentence. I also set up educatin askinants for half quantrilim. Structured so that the funds could only be used for education and could only be assessed by the selvas when they were old all the moke. No parental oversight of the funds. No parental oversight of the funds. I parental oversight of the funds. I putter with a risk account sealed to be open. Not encrypted. Not encrypted trend quan tid sternien 21. Not engrubber. Not a sleefer. Just my side herns, witten honestly, so that someday they would now what their grandfather had been through, the been through van, 3 through ben kaimen humbis about what it meant, about what it meant. I pet Helen's Riziki box. I pet the photos, albums. I pet her wedding ring, the cardigan she had worn so often it had vodos. I ket he fatted on the elbows. I kept my photos, my tolls are mine, and they were coming with me. The hardest moment was standing in the backyard at 6 in the morning on the last day before I handed over the keys. Helene had pointed a rust case bush Hamlin's head planted, a rust bush along the back fence in 2001, and it had grown into so serious over the years. Every June it was extravagant. Siri over the years. Every June it was extravagant. SHEU said to bring cut roses in and put them in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill and they would sit there for a wick. I stood there looking at that from quotes. 10. I went tolls, sevis my coffee and drove to Dayton Tone, Garden Center and Bodge and Center and Bocot and Cellocontainer roast in the Sam color and put it in the back of the truck with the other 13s. It lives on my back, potato in 2 sits now. I canjed my sellin now back, potato in 2 6 on now. I canjed my sellin now. I did not live a forwarding, address with ether doctor. Neil had my new contact information and that was sufficient. I drove southwest on I-40 on a Friday morning in April. I had a small house in a 2-sisson Nadeford hud that I had found online and flown out to sea in Johnnery before I had even told the full plan. Single story. Good light in the mornings. A patio facing west so the sunsets were visible from a lawn fouch hair. And a 2 carriages that 1 car was never going to use, which meant I had space fit for upper exactly what I had in mind. I drove 2 days. Stayed 1 night in Dayton. I drove 2 days. Stayed 1 night in Amarlio because it was familiar and Halio because it was familiar and Helene, and I had stopped there on Turajather. On Helen and drewed goodbye there. The was still good. 2 sessen in apparel is something ilzy. I had not live anywhere Denny forswear to be poor. The light is different. The mornings have a specific kind of quit that Okyoev that Okyo never had, not because Okyo is noisa, but because efferent qualit. I load the truck, set up the bedroom, put Helen's recipe box on the kitchen counter where I could see it, and on the 3rd day I set up the garage the way I weigh it. 8 had retired, fully 2 years before, and his wife had passed the previous spring, and he had been retelling around his house in Dayton with nothing much holding him there. I has him in January if he wanted to bring him there. I sked him in January if he wanted to bake. 10. Hersion quote, I have never been to Arizona, and I am 70 years old, and I think that is reason oath. He bought, Hersion quote, a house 4 streets over. About 3 months after I left Dayton, Neil called. He said Lena had contacted his office. They had found out about the house, Sarah and the Declex Sarah, and they could not reach me on my old number and wanted to know where I was and what had in fad happened to the assets. Neil told them I was well and that happened to the assets. The hemos cam with the hured. Lena wota won one. Very formal at first, which is how she gets when Siv is 12. She has to have weird. She besetted the hated, scared them. She set when had acted without talking to any for one. She said she could not believe what mod famlo. She has to be to but not believe a wormano, as if anyone had been visiting it. Paulins was shorter. She said Cyrus missed me, and she was worried and squared, and could I please just let them know I was safe? The tone was different from Lena's. There was something no, I was safe. The tone was different from Lena's. There was something of nath. There was something if nodded that melt more honest. Instead, about 2 weeks later, Neil received a letter from a columnist attorney. The letter Miss Attorney, the letter expressed conquer about my recent financial activity and raised the question of undoing footellers and fletters and scantail and raised discussion of undoing sinsen, whether besekids recussion. The meaning was not. Nail sent back the notarized financial records, the complete CR chronology I had with it to Mito the night of the Christmas dinner, the documentation of every anony but payment. I had been to both families over eFwares. The clean title transfers on both pairs over eFwares. Botters from my doctor and my financial advisor. Amand have send Cummins, bun computed slim managaning and growing his own hesits, for 3 DT selling it in parket per tree. Beckett is selling at Hevigads for 3. Derek's attorney went coit within 3 weeks. I wrote one AMA to both my Dodgers and sent it from my new address. I told them I was in good health and living W's. Week, and that I was gladding formings of UE. Had a way to reach me. I told them I had spent Acewars trying to stay in their lives, and that I had cooked Christmas mass dinners nurs nobody came to Samartaven to entry even to into events. I found out about Throff, Natworts and Marden. I forts and managed afores and managed about. Scare alone and spent my 6-5 birthday watching a baseball game with my Hadaborda. Showed Yube. I told them about the mortgage payments I had covered for Ford for Pauline and the therapeutic. For Pauline said the therapy bills. For Stanany must daw, Bostanany mustly. Because I had wanted them to be okay and not to feel like they owed them him anything. I told them that was the me okay and not to feel like they owning thing. The silence around it. Because what it targeted me was that they could take what I offered and feel nothing from me in return, and never even now they were doing it. I told them the education accounts for the grandchildren were set and that the money would be there when the kids needed it, and that was between me and them, not yous. I told them that I theater of them genuinely endeavored father in their lives. I was open to that, but it would require showing up consistently and not only when something of mine was in question. I said that respectfully, and I meant it respectfully. 10. I closed the laptop and went out to the garage and turned on the work light and started sanding a shelf. I was raking for in the hallway. The responses were more or less what I expected. Pauline said she was sorry for real this time and that she had been going back and forth about calls about conceiving coming form nonce. Derek did not write. I responded to Moth. I responded to Pauline with one line. I said I appreciated her saying that and not in with one line. I said I appreciated her saying that and would be open to talking when she were ready to do it without an. I have not poired. That was 6 weeks ago. Neil told me last month that Darrett's Eternus and Twanning sent one final letter and Tamil sent back one final responses and it's half one final responses and it has been quite sincere. I figure it will stay QWalk. There's nothing to Q it. It has been 11 months since I drove out of Dayton. I wake up when I wake up. When I wake up, I make Sophie and drink it and link it in the garage with the door open while the Nayford Hutter is still. Coal plain while the Roford is still coal. I drive out to the Nation Park on dies with Harlot and Fordoed in National Park on say Tutter days were Sharrowed and 12. I have been cooking from Helen's recipe box more and more. I made her cranberry heresy last week for no reason at all, just because I wanted it. I donated a portion of what Helen and I had saved over the years to a hospice foundation that provides support car achieving spouses. People who are doing what I did, alone and without enough help. I wanted that money to go somewhere Helen would have pointed at and say that one. I do not miss waiting. I do not miss checking my phone for some thing that was not coming. I do not miss sitting at phone. I do not miss sitting at the gown. I do not miss sitting at the apple, hoping that this year would be grint. What I miss Helen. That is a different things entirely and it does not get smaller, but I am learning to carry it in a way that can knock me over anymore. If there is one thing I want to say to whoever is watching this, it is something Helen used to say when a patient's family was not showing up the way they should. She would come home and sit down and say John, 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 and say John. At some point, you tack what is in front of you and bleed from there. I spent 8 hours waiting for my tarves, baiting for my doctors to be where tear. I am spending whatever comes. There's 7, waiting for whatever comes next bleeding from where I actually am where. If this story means something from here, calm as MX building from where I actually am where. If this story means something to you, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from and what is on your mind. There are more of yous out here than people realized, and every single one of your stories matters. I have been thinking about something Helen said once, a long time before any of this happened, when we were sitting on the back porch and one of the neighbors was going through something difficult with their son. She said, George, the hardest thing about loving people is that you cannot make them into who you need them to be. You can only decide what you are willing to accept. I did not fully understand that then. I thought I did. I thought it was just something wise that she said the way she said a lot of wise things, and I nodded and moved on. I understand it now in a way that is located somewhere below my ribs, the way you understand things that have cost you something real. What happened between me and my daughters did not happen because they were born without capacity for decency. It happened because I allowed a pattern to establish itself, and then I allowed that pattern to continue because I was afraid of what naming it would cost me. That is not a judgment on them alone. That is on me too. Every year I set that table and waited. I was teaching everyone in my life that my presence had no weight, that my time had no value, that my grief was a private matter that did not require their attention. I was patient in a way that functioned like permission. The cause and the effect were plain once I stopped looking away from them. When a person gives without limit and accepts without condition and never once says this is not acceptable, the people around them learn exactly what they can get away with. That is not cruelty always. Sometimes it is just human nature, finding the path of least resistance. Derek found that path and walked it deliberately. My daughters found it and walked it because they had learned from the time they were young that dad would show up regardless, so showing up themselves became optional. What changed was not them. What changed was me deciding that the pattern ended here. There is a version of this story where I am bitter, where I sit in Tucson replaying every slight and cataloging every year of neglect and letting it define whatever time I have left. I chose not to live in that version. Not because it would be wrong to be angry. I was angry. I earned the right to be angry, but because anger as a permanent residence does not honor anything. It does not honor the 34 years I had with Helen. It does not honor the man I tried to be for most of my life. It does not honor the grandchildren I set those 529 accounts up for, kids who had nothing to do with the decisions their parents made. The hardest kind of intelligence is the kind that looks at a situation clearly without making it worse than it is or better than it is. Just seeing it. I spent 8 years not using that kind of intelligence because I did not want what I saw to be true. When I finally used it, everything became very simple, very quickly. Walking away was not weakness. Building a new life in a place where nobody owed me anything and I owed nobody anything was not running from something. It was running toward something. Toward mornings that were mine. Toward work done with my hands that had nothing to do with anyone's expectations. Toward Harold and bad coffee and desert light. The rosebush Helen planted in 1991 is on my patio now in a pot. It bloomed 3 weeks ago. I brought one of the roses inside and put it in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill the way she always did. That is what I am building from.